Continuing You Could Change the World, The Christopher Approach by James Keller. In chapter 15. And I think we stopped with, if they are determined to put it to use in some vital way at a profession which, though not in itself religious, abounds in apostolic opportunities. Those who entertain even a passing inclination towards the religious life are motivated by high and unselfish ideals. There is a willingness to embrace a life requiring a constant adaptation to the plans and demands of others, because they are stimulated by such high purpose. These people have disposed themselves to devote the major part of their time and energies to working for others, with only a small portion of such time and energy set aside for their own convenience and entertainment. They are ready to accept a life of limited income, are ready to put aside the possibility of accumulating even moderate wealth. For those who have already settled down in life, it may be difficult, of course, to transfer to fields of activity where there is great need of apostolic lay action. However, there are tens of thousands of young men and women each year over the country who, though the professional religious life is not for them, would be heartened to know that they can still have an important part to play, individually and personally, on a full-time basis, since they, above all others, harbor a particular sense of purpose for their lives. They might well be regarded as first-line Christophers, carrying into the important spheres of influence a vision and determination which are not always possessed by others. Snatch faith from disaster. Just before his death in 1936, the zealous lay apostle G.K. Chesterton made a significant statement that should have a special meaning for every first-line Christopher. He realized far better than most the need for haste in increasing the missioners of light to offset the promoters of darkness. The issue is now clear, he declared. It is between light and darkness, and everyone must choose his side. If this issue is faced squarely without any further delay, there is great hope for the future. It concerns all men of good will, yet it should be expected that those who have felt the call of God at some time or another would be more keenly aware of the peril. It should be expected that they would be more ready and anxious to do something about it, and more quickly to be found leaping into the forefront of the ranks of those who are as determined to save the world as others are to wreck it. In this time of world crisis, brought on by advancing inroads of materialism and godlessness, these first-line Christophers have it in their power to snatch faith from disaster if they can be found in sufficiently large numbers to carry Christ into the marketplace. Well, that's more along the lines of belief that's making the difference here, right? People like these possess the primary ingredient of purpose to make God known, better understood, and more widely loved among all men. They recognize that man was born to work, and since God made the world and everyone in it, they further recognize that their first service belongs to Him. In a very real sense, they can be God's assistants, as Christ bearers, their lives and their powers, not dissipated, but utilized in serving Him and all mankind. If one by one they step forward into the ranks of those who are working for light, and are not merely talking against darkness, they can do much to change the world itself for the better. The power of just one person, such as they cannot be exaggerated, for they hold in their hands the light of the world, the one cure for all darkness, one small light. This point was brought home to me quite graphically some time ago at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. Final arrangements to hold a benefit concert were being discussed, and at the close of the talks, the assistant manager offered to show me the seating arrangement of the building. The hour was late, and all of the other employees had long since gone home. The interior of the auditorium was a blanket of darkness that clouded our view, and as we walked slowly forward, aroused our senses to vague imaginings at the sound of our own footsteps, asking me to wait where I was until he could switch on the main lights. The assistant manager left me and went on alone, his figure as he moved down the aisle. Then, across the stage could scarcely be seen. Suddenly he stopped. There was the sound of a match scratching against wood. A tiny sliver of light appeared, small as it was, from where I stood, at the back of the opera house. That speck of light was greater than all the darkness around it. A tiny piece of sulfur tipped to wood had made that possible. After that, to multiply that tiny glow thousands of times and dispel the shadows which still remained was but the work of a minute. There was the click of a switch. From all corners of the auditorium, clusters of electric lights flooded the opera house, and the darkness was gone. That's how it is with all of us. The least person, no matter how insignificant, who is interested in bringing the light of Christ's truth to the whole world, is likewise a pinpoint of light in the darkness, and it is, by God's grace, greater than all the encircling gloom. All that is needed to remove the rest of the darkness is to multiply that speck of light 1,000,000 times or more. Darkness disappears in the same proportion as light is added. It is as simple as that. In proportion as Christ bearers dare to penetrate the darkness with the light of Christ, so will it diminish and eventually disappear. Some recognize this challenge, others do not. One young woman entered the convent and prepared to embrace the religious life, only to realize at the last moment that such a life was not meant for her. Well, perhaps the following is going to be how she actually had a religious life rather than, basically being paid to maintain a churchy position. Back in the world, she gave up all thought of continuing on as a part-way lay apostle. She took a job with the telephone company, where the physical conditions are excellent so far as work was concerned. Yet, she has neglected to bring with her the spiritual impetus which had once sent her to embrace the religious life. Another young woman, on the other hand, who also prepared to be a nun, did carry over her high sense of purpose into the world of everyday affairs, when circumstances compelled her to give up a cloistered career. A leaflet which described the United Nations organization and the need for qualified men and women with sound values to work in furthering its aims gave her the cue for which she was searching. And as you may know, I have a book by a guy who used his position in the UN to condemn the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Iranians for not following Islamic law. And all three of those countries said that anybody following him, anybody that listed themselves as a follower of the guy when he was a scholar, not claiming to be anything more than a scholar, were banned from their country. And someone from the dictator in Egypt in 1991 had him killed. I'm not saying that some of the stuff he did towards the end of his life was okay. I'm just saying, people can use their position in the UN for good and for whatever their faith-based, right? In the beginning, however, time after time, she was refused employment on the ground that she lacked the proper qualifications. Still, she persevered. Finally, she was accepted for a position where she has innumerable opportunities to put Christopher action into practice in helping build a better world. This woman, as well as a young man who once studied for the ministry in California and is now in charge of an important department of the state government there, together with an ex-seminarian who is the public relations head of a large manufacturing concern, which has been free of both management and labor abuses during the entire 20 years he has held the office. Each of these and countless others, too numerous to mention, have brought and still are bringing Christ into the marketplace. All have the same things in common: high ideals and a supernatural purpose, readiness to embrace a life of self-sacrifice, recognition of the need for daily spiritual exercises, willingness to accept cheerfully a life of comparative poverty, apostolic desire to devote all one's time and effort to bringing God to man and men to God. And of course, remember the gender-neutral aspect of he and him and men and, that sort of thing. We are convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that many others would plunge into the thick of things if they would just stop to realize the immeasurable good they could do. And there is a breathtaking hope for the future when the thousands of first-line Christophers began to number in the hundreds of thousands. If you won't, who will? To have such a lofty life objective, even if only in a passing way, is nothing short of a great gift from God, even if it cannot be fulfilled completely. It should not, therefore, be rejected or completely ignored by those who have been so privileged. Perhaps God is calling them to a special apostolate in the world, which could never be exercised by one set apart exclusively for the religious life. For, as important and necessary as their work is, they cannot go into the many phases of the marketplace. They can guide, direct, and encourage, yes, but they depend on lay Christ-bearers to carry the torch into every segment of public life. Those in religious life cannot take a job, for instance, as clerk to a Supreme Court justice, teacher in a state college, official in a labor union, personal director in a corporation, staff writer on a newspaper, secretary to a magazine editor, or one of 1,000 other posts in vital spheres where so much is at stake. Any, therefore, who have ever felt stirring within them that divine urge to be another Christ in their own limited way, and another Luke's, light and life, lights and truth and good and that sort of stuff, are the whole formula. Light, love, life, no matter who they are, where they are, or what they are, should do everything in their power to nurture and strengthen it. Epheros, illuminate, bringing, If they are generous with God, He will be more than generous with them. If they are willing and determined in His name to go into the turmoil of the marketplace, regardless of how pagan it may be, and by pagan they mean anything not Christian, monotheist included, because remember this is before the 1967 change in that label, not to find fault with it, but to make it even a tiny bit better, because they have added their speck of light, then they will be embarking on a lifetime of thrilling, satisfying, even though hidden, venture that will continue on past death into eternity. They will begin to experience, possibly for the first time in their lives, the sublime difference between the confining limitations of mere striving for self and the exhilarating privilege of the fixed purpose of serving all mankind. In a very real sense, there will never be a dull moment in their lives. The worse the problem is, the more they will relish tackling it. Misunderstandings, setbacks, ridicule, even an occasional kick in the teeth will be taken in stride. In fact, they will count the day lost that does not bring to them some share, small or large, of the suffering that was Christ's, and which He promised must be the lot of anyone who would be His co-worker. Buoying them up every inch of the way will be the deeply satisfying and stimulating assurance that, inadequate as they may be, Christ works in, through, and with them. The further they get into the apostolate, the more humble they will become. The more they will realize that they are nothing more than errand boys or messengers, but still, by God's grace, the connecting links between God and men. Oftentimes it may be truthfully said of them that with you there, Christ is there. The anointing, if you think of it that way. And if they are not there, Christ is not there. Yes, make no mistake about it. They are His personal representatives, and the one thing He begs of people, of all else, is not merely to adore Him, but as a proof of their love, to bring Him into the midst of the darkness, even into the hate, the sordidness, the repulsiveness of every walk of life, where paganism holds sway over weak, confused humanity. And paganism is, of course, a word for Pagan and heathen, it has more to do with poor people and their housing than it does anything actually cultural, you know. Um, Sink spiritual foundations deep. To do this on a lifetime basis, it is only good sense for them to get into the routine of some sort of spiritual daily dozen in order to start sinking their spiritual foundation deep and to keep in good spiritual trim. Doing this will help them persevere over the long years in which they will be vitally needed. It will aid them to overcome paganism, for paganism overcomes them. It will assist them to balance action with the source of any good they may do. Now, what would be a better word for paganism? Secularism? Yeah, secularism. Secularism, yeah. It will enable them to rise above the trials and temptations that the devil, with all his subtlety and persistence, always employs to trip up any and all and make things uncomfortable for him. Faithfulness to daily spiritual exercises will serve to keep them ever conscious that they are in the presence of God and that they have a most important mission of life to perform. And they will soon find that their every action becomes a prayer. It is an old axiom that you can't give what you haven't got. They should not, however, mistake that to mean that if they are not spiritual experts, they can't do anything. No, far from it. There's not a person in the world who cannot give something to the betterment of the world, no matter how far removed from God one may be. He still remains a child of God, and therefore he can still do something for God, thereby coming at least 1 degree closer to his Maker. Now, the Bible kind of doesn't really make that point. It makes the point that you can choose to become a child of God or a child of Satan, depending on your beliefs and actions. And I've detailed that elsewhere. But it is likewise true that one would play a special role, such as that of a first-line Christopher, must make a special effort to develop his interior life and increase his spiritual power, not simply for his own self-sanctification, but above all else for the sanctification of the world. The more one prays, the more one grows in the knowledge and love of God, the more hopeful one becomes, and therefore more effectively brings him into the world. For Catholics, the following is offered as a suggested daily schedule: morning prayers, meditation or reflection, even 3 minutes a day would be of value. Whenever possible, attendance at Mass and reception of Holy Communion, grace at meals, as well as recitation of the Rosary and the Angelus, reading of a spiritual book, a minimum of 5 minutes a day, and a few verses of the so-called New Testament. I'm inserting the word so-called because that title was added later. Special prayer to the Holy Spirit before more important tasks. Night prayers and examination of consciousness. Now, Jesus, Matthew 7:22-23, said to not do good deeds in his name, any good deeds, not to heal in his name, not to exercise in his name. He'll cast away these people as the sort that never knew him, and working outside of the law that he was bringing. So where does it say to treat Gabriel as a deity? Ruch Patush. This simple routine would take a very small portion of time out of the 24 hours a day, but would go a long way in making the entire day purposeful and fruitful. If it is not possible to follow any but a few of these exercises, each person should select what he or she likes. But whatever is decided on, it should be lived up to. The day should not be allowed to end without fulfilling whatever each has prescribed for himself or herself. The discipline of being faithful is valuable in itself, but the long-term worth of the daily treatment will be felt in an increasing way the longer a person perseveres in it. Some time ago, when talking with an outstanding magazine writer about this hope of guiding into vital fields as first-line Christophers, the many thousands over the country who had contemplated entering a religious life, as well as all others interested in going part-way full-time, this man made a quick reply that has stuck in my memory and has prodded me to do something about it. If you have ever got enough people like that in the places that count, and as much interested in saving everybody else as they are in saving themselves, you will certainly be throwing an awful lot of grace around the world. It was a rather blunt statement, but its truth was a challenge. Well, its truth was challenging. We must not fail them. Emphasis on a sturdy spiritual life is necessary above all else, but ranking next in importance is the broad vision of Christ. The devil takes special delight in getting anyone with apostolic potentialities to become so preoccupied with nooks and corners that he misses the great issues that harness the world. After a while, he can't see the forest for the trees. There is strong gripping temptation to withdraw himself into one's little world of getting the God and myself complex, instead of the fuller, truer, and most essential God, myself, and everybody else attitude. It is so easy, strangely enough, for those who devote themselves most faithfully to spiritual exercises to become over-solicitous about saving self, body, and soul, while ignoring the pitiful plight of the vast numbers over the earth who are starving physically, mentally, and spiritually. Yes, even those who, at one time or another in their lives, gave some thought or dedicating themselves 100% to God, and souls not infrequently show little hesitancy in taking back about 80% when they get into the narrow rut of their own limited spheres. A special obligation rests on those of us who are Catholics. We are entrusted with the fullness of God's truth. Well, if you're a Catholic, that word in the Bible, if it really refers to universal truth. However, there is always the danger of our overlooking the fact that this truth of God is meant for others as much as it is meant for us. We have a serious obligation to offer it to them, at least by way of good example, but not to force it upon them. As individuals, we often betray the truth. Most frequently, this betrayal is brought about by failing to have an all-embracing, that is to say, Catholic desire to bring all men to that fullness of truth, which we are fortunate enough to possess. Yet these others, who lack the fullness of the truth of Christ, are by no means all in utter darkness. They too possess in varying degrees the true light, which enlightens every man that comes into the world. They too can be bearers of such light as they possess. The Gospels make it clear that Christ took men as they were and built on the raw material offered him. To a chosen few, he gave special training and instruction to equip them to be full-fledged, fully accredited apostles. Yet at the same time, he wished every person who had even the smallest consciousness of his truth to participate actively in spreading it. He was willing to accept assistance from any well-meaning source, and in so doing, he occasionally ran counter to his disciples. They were obviously proud of themselves when one day they told him that a certain man was casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him, because he followeth not with us. But Christ corrected them, Forbid him not, for he that is not against you is for you. Luke 9:49-50. See, it wasn't Jesus' way to have people do things in his name, but he wasn't, until they were ready to follow him, he wasn't going to stop them, right? He wasn't forcing people to stop things, what I mean. He did not keep his first disciples waiting for years until their instruction would be so perfect that they would be certain not to misrepresent him. On the contrary, he seems to have urged them to be his messengers from the start, sending them to hand on what light. That's the definition of Lucifer, right? Someone who brings light. They had, and to publish the good news as they had taken it in. And those who possessed of the light, who carried it to others less fortunate, were rewarded by an ever-deepening insight into the truth in all its fullness and beauty. So it was then, so it is now. Any effort a man makes to grasp the truth and live the life is certain to bring him closer to Christ. Thou wouldst not have sought me, he said to St. Augustine, had I not already been seeking thee. God wants man, though he does not need him. His grace is penetrating, ever-present, and ever-pressing upon us, and it will use any hold it has on man to make its grasp more secure. Besides, it is a law of our nature that we can only take in new truth in terms of the old. No missioner begins his work by belittling even the crudest absurdities of the religion of the people to whom he is gone. The good missioner, like St. Paul on the Areopagus, looks for common ground, and In the Quran, it says not to blaspheme the falsehoods attributed to religion, or they're going to, because it might provoke somebody to blaspheme the truths of religion. Suppose the man with you, whom you go to work every day with, believes in some power he is willing to call God, and suppose that some lingering fragrance of the poetry of the Sermon on the Mount still encourages him to believe that God is a Father in heaven, who cares for the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, and even one hair on the head of a man. Suppose he has no affiliation with any church, and is hardly able to grasp what the word Christian means, yet would resent being refused that name. Is he your ally or your enemy? Perhaps he is a little of both, but you may still urge him to spread that portion of the truth he already possesses to the many he can contact. And you cannot, who have never heard or imagined that the hairs on their heads meant anything to anyone. If you are thinking to yourself, who shall go? And you feel your friend would answer, here I am, send me. Why should you hesitate to send him into a darkness more complete than his? By his very going, he may come closer to Christ. A doctor possessing the truth of medicine does not compromise with disease when he succeeds in getting a sick man to accept only a small fraction of that truth. Even getting his patient to follow one principle of good health, such as brushing his teeth, is a step in the right direction. The acceptance of one simple principle, more often than not, arouses a voluntary desire for more, because the human mind has a natural love for truth, which sometimes needs the merest prompting to become more fully aroused. Yet, even when the acceptance of a fragment of truth does not lead to the gradual adoption of the whole, a 1% gain is not to be despised. Every bit counts. Good and true, or evil and ignorant, it all adds up, right? The Marxists today furnish one of the most graphic examples of unswerving allegiance to a creed without the slightest suggestion of compromise. Not for one moment do they waver down their doctrine. Not in any way do they ever convey the idea that any other belief is the equivalent of theirs. Still, they have been unusually successful in getting millions to go along with them as well-wishers, sympathizers, fellow travelers, and in dozens of other classifications, ranging all the way from the one-percenters on up. All of these well-wishers, sympathizers, and fellow travelers serve a purpose for the cause of Marxism, little as they may realize it, quite apart from any deception they use in other matters. The communists, to pay them credit, have shrewdly seen that it is a sounder missionary approach to get people to move one step by step towards Marxism over a period of years than it is to expect them to advance too far too quickly. During this transition process, one of the most effective means to ensure steady progress towards Marxism is to encourage novices to play a partial role in passing on or otherwise promoting some theory of atheistic materialism. And got into a argument with one of the guys in the neighborhood that was like, oh, you can't criticize Marxism because Pauline Christianity is communist. Well, not all communism is Marxism. By the same token, if the 70 million in our land who belong to no church could be encouraged to embrace and practice even one truth of Christ, they would be advancing, even if ever so slightly, in the right direction. Not only did Christ, by word and example, make it clear that he welcomed any who would spread his truth in whatever measure, his greatest apostle Paul was most explicit about it in his letter to the Philippians. And many of the brethren in the Lord, growing confident by my bounds, are much more bold to speak the word of God without fear, some indeed even out of envy and contention, but some also for goodwill preach Christ. Some preach Christ out of charity, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel, and some out of contention preach Christ, not sincerely, supposing that they raise affliction to my bonds. But what then? So that by all means, whether as a pretext or in truth, Christ be preached. In this also I rejoice, yea, and I will rejoice. Philemon 1:14-18. A missionary project. To be an effective apostolic instrument, therefore, a first line, Christopher, must be anxious to go to all, especially those farthest from Christ, to launch out daringly, in short, to be a missionary. He should regard the job to be done as plainly a missionary project. God has put that little bit of the missionary in every human being. Monsignor Ronald Knox, in his recent translation of the New Testament, made at the request of the Catholic bishops of England, renders this passage as follows. Philemon 1:14-18. And most of the brethren, deriving fresh confidence in the Lord from my imprisonment, are making bold to preach God's word with more freedom than ever. Some of them, it is true, for no better reason than rivalry or jealousy. But there are others who really proclaim Christ out of goodwill. Some, I mean, are moved by charity because they recognize that I am here to defend the gospel. Others by party split, proclaiming Christ from wrong motives, just because they hope to make my chains gall me worse. What matter, so long as either way, for private ends or in all honesty, Christ is proclaimed. Of that I am glad now, yes, and I shall be glad hereafter. And now we've reached to the point where that biblical prophecy is fulfilled that talks about the the third of the host of heaven falling bit, because it's estimated a third of the church leaders, people who are, whether it's a professional or lay role like that, aren't even Christian. And I've encountered people that's like, oh, well, I can make more money by something other than Christianity, so I'm going to, other than being a preacher, so I'm going to do something else. So, it further confirms that sort of professional priesthood thing to me, but, to not take part in that sort of thing. But the evil-minded have long recognized this and constantly kept reminding their followers not to keep yourselves what we give you, but spread it. Don't take any job, take a job that counts, a job where you can spread ideas. Now, if there wasn't the people, the televangelists and the local people trying to get richer than their congregation, how well would Christianity hold up? But then you could say, well, then that would be the most authentic sort of Christianity, that it's the Christianity that people are doing completely volunteer. Because didn't Jesus kind of set up like the other messiahs and Christ and Emmanuels and prophets, set things up for everybody to be priests and priestesses and nobody to get paid for leading religious services?